On the 11th of June, 2 years ago, at 4:40 in the afternoon, I was on my knees in 8 inches of bilge water inside a 32-foot sailboat, in a boatyard 90 miles from my own house, photographing a corroded keel bolt. That is the most boring sentence I will say today. It is also the only reason I still have my daughter. My name is Roan Whitlock. I am 41 years old, and I survey boats for a living. I climb into places nobody wants to go. I find the rot under the paint, and I write it down. And while I was kneeling in that bilge with a flashlight in my teeth, somebody 2 counties away was pressing a copy of my professional seal into a document that would help put a family on the water in a boat that was never going to hold. Welcome back to Cheating Tales Lab, where the lie usually starts in a bedroom and the wreckage always shows up somewhere else. Here is the thing I want you to carry out of this one, because it cost me everything to learn it. Your name is an asset. Your signature, your license number, your stamp, your credentials. That is property, and property can be stolen quietly, for years, by people who sit across from you at breakfast. I did not figure it out because I was clever. I figured it out because a 7-year-old girl slid her hand into mine at a dinner party and whispered, "Dad, we have to go. I saw something." Roan Whitlock's father used to say that a boat is a rumor until somebody writes it down. Yancey Whitlock had built wooden hulls in a shed on the north side of Corbin Bay for 31 years, and he had a saying for everything, but that was the one he repeated most, usually with a pencil behind his ear and a plank across 2 sawhorses. "People will tell you what a boat is," he said. "The seller will tell you. The broker will tell you. The fellow at the bar who owned one like it in 1984 will tell you. None of that is the boat. The paper is the boat." Roan had been 11 years old the first time he heard it, and he had not understood a word. He understood it now. He made his living from it. Corbin Bay sat on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, in Wexford County, a town of 4,100 people that swelled to 12,000 between the last week of May and the first week of September, and then went quiet again, like a house after a funeral. There was a marina with 360 slips. There was a cherry orchard on every hill road heading inland. There was a lighthouse that had been decommissioned in 1970 and photographed roughly 9 million times since. And there was one accredited marine surveyor within 60 miles in any direction, and his name was on the side of a gray pickup truck, Whitlock Marine Survey. The job was simple to describe and hard to do. When somebody bought a boat, or insured one, or made a claim on one, an insurer wanted an independent professional to climb all over that hull and say what it actually was. Not what the broker said, not what the owner remembered, what it was. Roan hammered moisture meters into decks and listened to the sound the hammer made. He crawled into engine spaces on his back with a mirror and a flashlight. He put on a dry suit in April water that would stop your heart in 9 minutes, and went under the boat to look at the running gear with his own eyes, because he had learned early that the difference between a good surveyor and a bad one is almost entirely a matter of how many uncomfortable places you are willing to physically put your body. And then he wrote it down. That was the part almost nobody saw, and the part that mattered. Every survey Roan Whitlock had ever performed lived in a system his father would have recognized, because his father had designed the bones of it on index cards. Every job got a number. Every number got a folder. Every folder held between 400 and 1,100 photographs, each one carrying its own timestamp and its own coordinates, because Roan had set his camera to record both 11 years ago and had never once turned it off. Every folder got backed up the same night onto a drive in his office and a second drive that lived in a safe deposit box at Wexford County Savings, which he swapped out on the first Saturday of every month. He had a written field log, in pen, in a bound book, because a bound book cannot have a page inserted into it later without somebody noticing. His wife thought this was a personality disorder. She said so cheerfully at parties. "Roan writes down what he had for lunch," she would say, and people would laugh, and Roan would smile and let it go, because there was no version of explaining it that did not sound like a lecture. Here is what he could not explain at a party. In the year Roan turned 19, a surveyor 2 towns over had passed a hull that had a soft stringer, and a family of 4 had gone into the lake off Point Betsy in October. 3 of them came out. Roan's father had gone to that funeral and had come home and sat in the truck in the driveway for 40 minutes without turning the engine off. And when he finally came inside, he had said only one thing to his son. He said, "That man wrote down what he wished was true." Roan Whitlock had built an entire adult life around never being that man. He was good at it. He was, in the flat and unglamorous way of a person who is quietly excellent at an obscure trade, one of the best in the region, and insurers 3 states away knew his report format on sight. He was also, at 41, a man with a bad back, a truck with 206,000 miles on it, 1 pair of dress shoes, and a 7-year-old daughter named Alberta, who had been called Birdie since the 3rd day of her life, and who was, in his private opinion, the single most interesting person in the state of Michigan. Birdie Whitlock counted things, not in an anxious way, in an appetite way. She counted the pilings on the town dock, the steps to the 2nd floor, the number of times a heron missed before it caught something. She could tell you how many blue cars had passed the house since breakfast. She had a habit of describing people by an object instead of a face, which made her testimony about the world both useless and extremely precise. The lady with the tooth necklace, the man who smells like the inside of a tire. She had been coming to job sites with her father since she was 4, sitting on a milk crate in a boatyard with a coloring book and a hard hat too big for her, and she knew the tools in his kit by their nicknames, which she had assigned herself, and which he had adopted, because you do. The pointy one, the clicky one, the pinchy thing. The pinchy thing was a handheld embossing seal, 4 inches of cast steel on a lever, that pressed Roan's name, his accreditation number, and the state of Michigan into the last page of every survey report he issued. It made a raised, blind-stamped impression you could feel with your thumb in the dark. It could not be photocopied. It could not be faxed. It had been cut for him, in 1999, by a die maker on Ordway Street, named Ivor Fenno, who had apprenticed under Yancey Whitlock's brother-in-law, and who had thrown in the leather case for free. Roan kept the real one in a welded lockbox under the back seat of his truck. He had a practice seal, a dud, no number on it, that lived in a kitchen drawer so that a small person could stamp construction paper into ruin on rainy Saturdays. Birdie had pressed that thing 10,000 times. She could have picked it out of a lineup at 40 feet. Remember that. He had met Simone Ballentine on a Tuesday in April when she came to hire him to fail a boat. That was not how she put it. She had arrived at the boatyard in a camel coat and boots that were wrong for the gravel, and she had explained, with the particular charm of a person who has never once been told no, that her family's brokerage had a client with a 42-foot motor yacht and a difference of opinion about its condition, and that they needed a surveyor with a reputation. She had watched him work for 6 hours in a cold wind. She had asked good questions. She had not flinched when he pulled a screwdriver out of a stringer with rot on the tip of it and held it up like a doctor holding up a slide. She had said, "So you actually tell people the truth, even when it costs your client money." He had said, "The client is the boat." She had married him 14 months later, in a tent on the bluff above her parents' house. And for a long time Roan believed that the thing she had fallen in love with was his incorruptibility. It took him 9 years to understand that she had not fallen in love with it. She had inventoried it. The Ballentines had been in Corbin Bay 4 generations, which in a resort town is the equivalent of a coat of arms. Ballantine Marine and Yacht occupied 11 acres on the South Shore, a brokerage with a glass showroom, 400 feet of service dock, a travel lift rated for 80 tons, and a heated storage barn that could swallow 60 hulls for the winter at $9,000 a season. Foster Ballentine, 69, was the name on the sign and the face in the Chamber of Commerce photographs. A big, weathered, handsome man who had spent the last 4 years being slowly emptied out by a lung disease he had earned honestly in a spray booth in the 1980s. Adelia Ballentine, 66, was the one who ran it. She had a habit of standing slightly behind her husband in photographs, one hand on his shoulder, which read as devotion and functioned as control. She wore her reading glasses on a chain. She remembered the name of everybody's dog. She had, over 4 decades, built a business that made money in 3 visible ways and one that was not visible at all. And she had done it with the absolute confidence of a woman who had decided very young that the rules were a kind of tax paid by people without imagination. Her son Cabot, 44, ran acquisitions. Cabot Ballentine had a laugh you could hear across a parking lot, and a way of putting a hand on the back of your neck when he greeted you, and he had never in his life been alone in a room with a consequence. Her younger daughter Elodie, 35, ran the showroom and the social media and had opinions about window treatments, and her older daughter Simone, 39, handled what the family called, without irony, the paperwork. Roan Whitlock kept the books for Ballantine Marine and Yacht 2 days a week. She also kept the books for Whitlock Marine Survey all 5 days, from a desk in the converted porch of their house on Kestrel Road, because it had made sense. She was good at it, Roan hated it, and a two-person business does not hire an office manager. She invoiced, she scheduled, she handled the report templates and the letterhead and the mail. She had the password to the Accreditation Society portal because Roan could never remember it. She had a key to the truck. In the 11th year of Roan's practice, the referrals from Ballantine Marine had become the largest single source of his work, and Roan had noticed and been faintly, privately pleased about it, in the way of a man who has finally been accepted by a family that spent 9 years making jokes about his fingernails. He had not asked the obvious question, which was why a brokerage that stood to lose money every time a survey came back honest would keep sending work to the one surveyor in the county who could not be leaned on. He would ask it eventually. He would ask it in a parking lot, holding his daughter's hand, in front of 2 federal agents. The engagement dinner for Gabe Whitlock and Neve Barlow was held on the 2nd Saturday of September, in the long room at the Corbin Bay Boat Club, with the west windows open and the lake going the color of a nickel. Gabe was Roan's younger brother by 8 years. He was a marine mechanic with forearms like mooring line and an inability to lie that had cost him 3 jobs, and he had proposed to Neve Barlow, an emergency room nurse with a laugh like a dropped tray of silverware, on the break wall in a rainstorm, because he had been carrying the ring for 11 days and could not stand it anymore. Their families were not the same kind of family. The Barlows were plumbers and teachers. The Whitlocks were 1 boat shed and 2 orphaned brothers. The Ballantines had offered the room at the club. Adelia had made the offer at Easter, warmly, in front of everybody, and Gabe had accepted before Roan could catch his eye, and that was that. Which is how 46 people came to be eating a plated dinner at the Corbin Bay Boat Club under a wall of vintage regatta photographs, at tables arranged by Adelia Ballentine's own hand, at a party that was theoretically for Roan's only brother, at which Roan Whitlock was seated at the far end of table 4, between a support column and an 11-year-old cousin with a tablet. Simone was at table 1, so was Bertie, briefly, before she got bored and started orbiting. It was not an accident, and it was not subtle, and it was not, honestly, new. It was the 9th year of a joke that had started at a 4th of July party in the 2nd summer of the marriage, when Cabot had come around a corner with a beer in each hand, looked at Roan standing by the ice, and said with genuine delight, "Oh, you're still hanging around." Everybody had laughed. Roan had laughed. It had been funny, sort of, the first time, in the way that a joke about how the new guy might not last is funny at a family party. Cabot had said it every single time he saw Roan for 9 years. At the club, at the bar, at 7:10, he said it again. He came in from the deck, smelling of cigar and lake wind, saw his brother-in-law standing alone with a glass of club soda, and lit up like a man finding a favorite chair. "Roan Whitlock," he said. "Still hanging around?" Elodie laughed. A man from the yacht club board laughed. Adelia, 3 feet away, did not laugh, but she smiled with her eyes down, the way you smile at a child doing something rude and clever. Roan said, "Somebody's got to keep the average up." It got a small laugh and cost him nothing, and he had been making that trade for 9 years. The toasts started at 8. Foster Ballantine went first, from a chair, with an oxygen line in his nose, and he was gracious and short, and he called Gabe a good young man. Adelia went second and spoke for 4 minutes about the boat club, the room, the history of the room, the flowers, and her own late mother's engagement in that room in 1959, and finished by welcoming Neve to what she called the Corbin Bay family, which was a strange thing to say about a girl who had grown up 9 blocks away. Then Cabot stood up with a champagne flute and told the story of how he had personally introduced Gabe and Neve, which was not true, and had done it at the marina, which was also not true, and everyone applauded, and Gabe's jaw did a thing that only his brother could see. Nobody mentioned Yancey Whitlock. Nobody mentioned Alberta Whitlock, who had died when Gabe was 15 and who had taught them both to swim in water so cold it made your teeth hurt. Nobody said the word brother out loud, except Gabe, once, when he thanked people for coming, and looked down the room at table 4 and said, "And my brother, who raised me," basically, and Roan lifted his glass, and there was a pause about a half-second too long before the room caught up and lifted theirs. Simone did not look at him during the pause. She was turned toward the head of the table, one hand flat on the cloth, laughing at something. Roan sat down. He was fine. That was the thing he would think about a great deal later. He had been fine. He had built a working life at the bottom of boats, alone, in the dark, with a flashlight, and a room full of people ranking him below a support column simply did not have the machinery to hurt him anymore. He had a brother getting married. He had a good year behind him. He had a kid somewhere in the building, committing crimes against a dessert table. At 8:31, the kid came back. Bertie Whitlock did not run. That was the first thing wrong. She came the length of the room at a fast walk with her chin down and her arms straight at her sides, past the cake, past her mother, past her Uncle Cabot, and she did not look at any of them, and when she reached her father she pushed herself into the gap between his chair and the column and slid her hand into his. Her hand was cold. That was the second thing wrong. It was 71 degrees in that room. "Dad," she said, at a volume meant only for him. "We have to go." He turned. He put his other hand over hers automatically, and he said, in the voice you use, "Hey, what's up, Bird?" And his daughter looked up at him with a face he had seen exactly twice before in her life, once in an emergency room at 2 in the morning, and once at her grandfather's funeral, and she said, "I saw something." Roan Whitlock looked at his daughter's face for perhaps a second and a half. There are people who would have said, "Sweetheart, sit down, we'll go in a bit." There are people who would have said, "Tell me here." Roan had spent 11 years being paid to notice when something did not match its description, and the thing in front of him did not match any description of a 7-year-old who had seen a spider or been told she could not have more cake. He stood up. He did not make a scene, because a scene was the one thing that would have been useful to everybody else in that room. He picked his jacket off the chair back. He told the 11-year-old with the tablet it was nice to meet him, and he walked the length of the room with his daughter's hand in his, and he stopped at table 1 and leaned down beside his wife. "Bird's not feeling great," he said. "I'm going to run her home." Simone Ballentine turned. She had a look on her face he would replay for months afterward, and at the time he read it as annoyance, and later he understood that it had been something considerably faster and colder than that. Her eyes went past him, to Bertie, and stayed there for a beat. She said, "What happened?" "Just tired," Roan said. She said, "I'll come." And Bertie's hand tightened around 3 of her father's fingers hard enough to hurt. "No," Roan said, easily. "Stay. It's Gabe's night. Somebody from our side should be here." He kissed the top of his wife's head, said goodnight to Adelia, gripped his brother's shoulder on the way past, and walked out through the double doors into the vestibule with its brass coat hooks and its framed 1959 regatta photograph and its smell of old carpet. They got as far as the doormat. "Tell me now," he said, crouching down. His daughter looked back at the doors. Then she said it in one exhale, the way children unload something they have been carrying in both arms. "Uncle Cabot has your pinchy thing." Roan Whitlock heard the sentence and did not understand it. He said, "My what, honey?" "Your pinchy thing," Bertie said. "The stamper. The real one, not the play one. It had the numbers." He was in the office with the boat pictures and the door was open a little and he was doing it on the papers, like this. She made the two-handed squeezing motion, a small girl operating a hand press, and there was a big pile and he did it lots. I counted 11, and then Grandma Adelia came, so I went by the coats. The vestibule was very quiet. Somewhere behind the doors, 46 people laughed at something. Roan said, carefully, because he could hear his own pulse, "Bird, are you sure it was the stamper?" She gave him a look of profound 7-year-old insult. "Dad," she said, "it's the pinchy thing. It's got the bit that sticks out that pokes you." He had dropped that seal on a concrete floor in the spring of 2019 and put a nick in the housing that raised a small burr of steel on the left flange. and he had been meaning to file it down for 4 years, and every time he used it, it caught the web of his hand. Every time he used it. Not the copy. He did not know yet that there was a copy. He would learn that in 11 days. What Roan Whitlock knew, standing on a doormat in a rented tuxedo shirt with his daughter's cold hand in his, was that a piece of steel that had never in 11 years been out of a welded lockbox except in his own hand had just been described, accurately, down to the burr, by a child who had watched a man he had eaten Thanksgiving dinner with press it into a stack of documents in a back office at his brother's engagement party. He said, "Okay, Bird, you did exactly right." She said, "Are you mad?" He said, "Not at you, not even a little bit." Then he said, "Is there anything else?" And his daughter, who counted things, said, "There's a man in the parking lot who was sitting in a car the whole time. He was there when we came. He has the same car as the one that parks by the mailbox at our house sometimes when you're gone." They went out into the parking lot at 8:39 in the evening. It was full dark by then, the way it goes in September on that shore, and the lot was 3/4 full and lit by 4 sodium lights on poles, and the lake was making the sound it makes. Roan's truck was in the second row. He got Birdie's booster seat door open and was reaching for her jacket when headlights came on 20 feet away and a car door opened, and then a second car door on the other side of the lot, which he had not been watching. A woman's voice said, "Mr. Whitlock?" She came into the sodium light with her hands where he could see them and a folder under one arm, mid-40s, close-cropped hair, a windbreaker with 4 letters across the chest that he could not read at that distance and would remember for the rest of his life. Behind her, a heavier man in a suit that had been slept in. She said, "My name is Wilhelmina Okonkwo. I'm a special agent with Coast Guard Investigative Service. This is Dov Farrow. He's an investigator with the Michigan Attorney General's Office, Insurance Fraud Unit. Are you Roan Whitlock, accreditation number 4419? Roan stood up slowly with his daughter's jacket in his hand. He said, "I am." Agent Okonkwo said, "Sir, we've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks. We've left 6 voicemails at your business number and sent 2 letters to your business address." And Roan Whitlock said the sentence that split his life into a before and an after, and he said it in complete innocence, and both investigators heard the innocence in it, and it was, in the end, the single most valuable thing he ever said. He said, "What business address?" There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Farrow's chin came up. Okonkwo said, "Mr. Whitlock, do you know a vessel named the Halcyon Girl?" He did. Everybody on that shore did. It was a 38-foot sport fisherman that had come apart in a following sea 11 miles off Corbin Bay in June of the previous year, with 4 people aboard. 2 had been recovered by a charter captain. 2 had not. A man named Odell Prentice, 38, and his son Rory, who had been 9 years old, and whose school picture had been on the front page of the Wexford County paper for a week, and on the community center bulletin board ever since. "I know of it," Roan said. "I never worked on it." Okonkwo opened the folder. She turned it around and held it up under the sodium light, and in the orange light Roan Whitlock looked at a photocopy of the last page of a pre-purchase condition and value survey, dated the 11th of June, 2 years before, on his letterhead, in his format, with his phrasing, over his signature, above his accreditation number, describing the hull, the stringers, and the transom of the Halcyon Girl as sound, seaworthy, and suitable for the intended use. At the bottom, in the raking light, was the ghost of an embossed seal. There was a very long moment in which the only sound in that parking lot was the lake. And then, a 7-year-old girl, who had been standing quietly against her father's leg, holding 3 of his fingers, looked up at the woman with the badge and said, in a small, clear voice, "My uncle has that. He was doing it just now. Inside. On the papers." Nobody expected that. Not the 2 investigators, who had driven 90 minutes on a Saturday evening, expecting to confront a corrupt surveyor in a parking lot, and had instead just received a spontaneous, excited utterance from a minor witness with no adult prompting, in the presence of 2 sworn officers, 60 feet from the building where the alleged act was occurring. Not Roan, who felt the ground move, and absolutely not the woman standing in the doorway of the Corbin Bay Boat Club with her arms folded, backlit, who had come out to see why her husband was taking so long. Simone Whitlock crossed the parking lot at a speed her shoes were not designed for. She arrived saying her daughter's name, and then, when she was close enough to read the 4 letters on Okonkwo's windbreaker, she stopped saying it. Agent Okonkwo said, "Ma'am, and who are you?" Simone said, "I'm his wife. What is this about?" And Dov Pharaoh, who had been quiet for the entire encounter, said, mildly, "Ma'am, are you also the office manager for Whitlock Marine Survey? Because we've been leaving voicemails at a number that answers as Whitlock Marine Survey for 3 weeks." Roan watched his wife's face in orange sodium light. He would tell people afterward that it had not been a look of guilt. Guilt is loud and useless. What crossed Simone Ballentine's face in that half-second was arithmetic, a rapid, competent, almost admirable recalculation. The face of a woman reading a fresh survey on a hull she thought she already understood. And then it was gone and replaced with concern. "I've been forwarding everything to Roan," she said. "He's terrible with his messages." Roan did not contradict her. That was the first decision he made, and he made it in under a second, and it turned out to be the correct one. He said nothing at all. He put his daughter in the truck and buckled her in, and closed the door and turned around and told Agent Okonkwo that he would come to whatever office she wanted, at whatever time, with counsel, and that in the meantime he was going to say one single thing, which was that on the 11th of June, 2 years ago, he had been at Sturgeon Point Marine, 91 miles north, performing an out-of-water survey on a Bristol 32, and that he could produce 440 photographs with embedded time and location data, a signed haul-out invoice, a fuel receipt, and a man named Marlon Osgood who had made him a sandwich. Pharaoh wrote it down. Okonkwo looked at him for a long moment and then handed him a card and said, "Mr. Whitlock, do not discuss the specifics of this with anyone." Anyone. She glanced, very briefly, at Simone. Then she said, "And sir, your daughter should not be interviewed by us tonight, and she should not be coached by anybody before she is." "Is that clear?" "Perfectly," Roan said. He drove home with his daughter and did not turn the radio on. Simone did not come home for 2 hours. When she did, she came in warm, apologetic, exhausted, and expert. She said the whole thing was insane. She said Cabot was an idiot, but he was not a criminal. She said Bertie had probably seen a stapler. She said, gently, that Bertie had been going through a phase of telling stories, hadn't she? And hadn't the teacher mentioned something? And wasn't it possible that a child who wanted to leave a boring party had found a way to leave a boring party? Roan Whitlock sat on the edge of the bed and listened to his wife of 9 years construct, in real time, the frame in which his daughter was a liar. He said, "You're probably right." He said it because he had just understood something, and he needed 48 hours in which nobody knew he had understood it. Here is what he had understood. Nobody had left him voicemails at a number that reached his desk. His business address, according to a federal agent, was not his house on Kestrel Road. Somebody had, at some point, changed where his professional mail went, and there was exactly one person on earth with the standing to do that. And a joke that a man had told for 9 years, "You're still hanging around," was not a joke about a marriage that might not last. It was a schedule. He waited until Simone was asleep, and then Roan Whitlock did the only thing he had ever been good at. He started documenting. He did not touch her tablet or her laptop. He had already worked out that anything he took from her devices would be poison in a courtroom and worse than useless. What he took was what belonged to him. 11 years of his own files, on his own drives, and the bound field logs in the cabinet in the porch office, which were his, and which he carried out to the truck in 2 milk crates at 3:15 in the morning and drove to his brother's apartment above the Marine Supply on Ordway Street. Gabe opened the door in a t-shirt and looked at the crates and looked at his brother's face and said, "Okay," and put coffee on. By 6 in the morning, they had it on the floor. Roan's method was brutally simple. He had a numbered log of every survey he had ever performed. He wrote out, from the log, every job number he had issued in the previous 4 years, 311 of them. Then he pulled the state's public vessel title and lien database, and the Accreditation Society's public verification tool, and the 2 big insurer portals he had legitimate professional access to, and he searched for his own accreditation number. 4419 came back on 311 reports he had written, and on 68 he had not. 68 condition and value surveys, spread over 5 years, all on his letterhead, all in his format, all above his signature and his number. Every one of them attached to a vessel sold, insured, or financed through Ballantine Marine and Yacht. Every one of them arriving at a valuation between 11 and 40% above what Roan Whitlock, looking at the photographs in the listing at 6 in the morning on his brother's floor, would have written for the same hull. And 19 of them were on hulls with a history. That was the part where Gabe stopped drinking his coffee. The 19 were salvage. Roan could see it in 10 minutes, because seeing it was his profession. A hull identification number that did not match the model year's format. A vessel that vanished from one state's total loss registry and reappeared 8 months later in Michigan with a new name. A listing photo where the gel coat on the transom was one shade brighter than the gel coat on the hull sides. Storm boats, flood boats, hulls bought at insurance auction for 11 cents on the dollar, cosmetically resurrected in a heated barn on 11 acres on the South Shore over a winter, given a new name, a new number, and a survey report from the most trusted man on that shore. The Halcyon girl had been called the Lucky Strike when a hurricane put it on its side in a marina in Alabama. Gabe Whitlock said, very quietly, Rory Prentice was in my Sunday school class. Roan said, I know. He did not sleep. At 8 in the morning he called a lawyer named Verity Ansell in Traverse City, whose name he had gotten from an insurer he trusted, and by 11 he was sitting across from her with a milk crate on the floor between them, and she listened for 50 minutes without saying anything except go on. At the end she said, Mr. Whitlock, I want to be clear with you about what you're holding. Right now, on paper, you are the most attractive defendant in this entire case. You have the credential. You have the motive of fee income. Your family has the boats. Every single one of those 68 documents says you did it, and the only thing you have that says otherwise is your own word and your own records. Roan said, my records are extremely good. She said, everybody says that. And Roan Whitlock reached into the crate and put on her desk a bound book with a cracked spine and 11 external drives in a foam case and a receipt from Wexford County Savings for a safe deposit box that had been rented continuously since 2014, and said, I have 440 photographs of the inside of a Bristol 32 from the afternoon they say I was in a boatyard 100 miles south of it. Each of them has a date, a time, and a set of coordinates written inside the file by the camera, and there is a version of every one of them that has been sitting in a bank vault since the first Saturday of the following month, untouched. Verity Ansell looked at the drives for a while. Then she said, all right. Now show me the stamp. The seal was the whole case, and both of them knew it within an hour. A signature can be traced. Letterhead can be copied out of a PDF in 11 seconds. A format can be imitated by anybody who has ever received one of Roan's reports. And over 11 years, several hundred people had. None of that proved anything about who had made a document. But the last page of a Whitlock survey carried a blind embossed impression. And an embossing die is a physical object, cut in steel, and physical objects are unique in exactly the way documents are not. Roan brought his real seal in from the truck lockbox in its leather case and pressed a fresh impression onto a sheet of Verity Ansell's letterhead, and then took the raking light photographs he had taken 10,000 times in his professional life, and there it was. The small deformation on the upper left of the raised border, a hairline flaw about 2 millimeters long, from the morning in the spring of 2019, when he had knocked the case off a workbench in Ludington, and the seal had landed flange first on a concrete floor. Every genuine Whitlock impression since March of 2019 carried that flaw. Verity Ansell put the photocopy of the Halcyon Girl report under a lamp and tilted it until the ghost of the embossing came up out of the paper, and they looked at the upper left of the border together for a long time. It was clean, which meant one of two things. Either that report predated the drop, which it did not, being dated 3 years after it, or somebody had a second seal. Somebody had had a second seal cut. There were, Roan knew, 4 shops in the Lower Peninsula that still cut embossing dies. 3 of them were in Detroit and Grand Rapids, and did work for banks and notaries, and would have required a copy of the accreditation certificate, which would have generated a file, which would have generated a record. The 4th was Fenno Stamp and Die, a storefront with a green awning on Ordway Street in Corbin Bay, 4 blocks from the water, where a 74-year-old man named Ivor Fenno still cut steel by hand on a machine his father had bought in 1951, and who had made Roan's original seal in 1999, and who had known Yancey Whitlock for 50 years, and who had a green awning because Yancey Whitlock had helped him hang it. Roan went alone, on a Tuesday, at 9:10 in the morning, and did not say why he was there. He asked Ivor how his knees were. He asked about Wiley, the grandson. He bought a rubber date stamp he did not need. And then he put his own seal on the counter in its cracked leather case and said, "Ivor, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to know before you answer it that I already know the answer, and that I am not here to hurt you." Ivor Fenno looked at the case on the counter for 11 full seconds. Then the old man put both hands flat on the glass, and he said, "I've been waiting 2 years for somebody to walk in that door." Ivor Fenno had cut the second seal in the January of 2 years before, on a Thursday, for a man who came in with a photograph of an existing impression and $1,100 in cash and a story about a client who had lost the original. The man had been very friendly. The man had put a hand on the back of Ivor's neck when he shook his hand. "I knew," Ivor said. He was standing at the back of his own shop with his arms folded across his chest like a man holding his ribs together. "I knew when he wouldn't give me the certificate. You always get the certificate, Roan. Your dad taught me that in '78. And I did it anyway, because it was $1,100 in February, and my furnace was out, and my grandson was living upstairs, and because I told myself a stamp is just a stamp, it's the man who signs it that matters." He said, "Then that boat went over out there, and I read the paper, and I have not slept right since." Roan said, "Ivor, did you write it down?" And Ivor Fenno, who had learned his trade from men who wrote everything down, reached under the counter, into the second drawer of a wooden card file that had been in that shop since before either of them was born, and pulled out a carbon copy work order, numbered, dated the 19th of January, describing a 2-inch round embossing die, custom, name and number as per customer sample, cash, no receipt requested. Across the bottom, in an old man's careful hand, Ivor had written the customer's name, Ballantine. He had also, because he had done it for 50 years and could not stop himself, taken a proof impression on a scrap of cardstock and stapled it to the work order, the way he had proofed every die he had ever cut. Roan Whitlock stood in a stamp shop on Ordway Street and looked at a clean, unflawed impression of his own name and number, made by a machine that was not his, stapled to a piece of paper with a date on it, and he thought about his father saying, "The paper is the boat." He said, "Ivor, I need you to not touch this again. I'm going to send a woman named Verity Ansell here this afternoon, and then some federal people, and you are going to tell them exactly what you told me, including the part that makes you look bad." The old man said, "Will I lose the shop?" Roan said, "I don't know, probably not. But Ivor, that boy was 9. Ivor Fenno said, "I know how old he was. That was the 9th of October. Between the 9th of October and the 20th of November, 3 things happened that Roan Whitlock had not planned for, and one that he had. The first was that he found out about Cass Ridgway. He was not looking for it. He was reconstructing the 68 surveys, and every one of them had gone through the same underwriter, Great Bay Marine Underwriters, out of Muskegon, and every one had been reviewed and bound by the same senior marine underwriter, a man named Casper Ridgway, 47, who had never once in 5 years kicked back a Whitlock report for the additional documentation that his own company's guidelines required on any vessel with a prior total loss flag. Not once. 68 times. Verity Ansell's forensic accountant pulled the pattern in 3 days, and buried in it, because expenses are always where a thing comes apart, were the folios. A hotel in Grand Rapids, 11 times in 2 years. Always Thursday into Friday. Always billed to the underwriting travel account with a seminar code that corresponded to no seminar. Roan looked at those dates for about 90 seconds before he went and got his own calendar off the wall. Thursdays. Every one of them a Thursday he had been away on a job. He sat with that for one evening. He allowed himself one evening in his brother's spare room with the light off, and he thought about the thing that was actually breaking his heart, which was not the hotel, and was not the underwriter, and was not even 9 years. It was that she had let a man put his hand on the back of her brother's neck, and hand $1,100 across a counter for a copy of her husband's name, and then come home and eat dinner and ask him how the Bristol was. The second thing was that on the 4th of November, Roan Whitlock filed for divorce, along with an emergency motion for sole legal and physical custody of Alberta Whitlock, age 7. The petition was a piece of work. It stated that the respondent was the subject of an active federal criminal investigation regarding fraudulent marine surveys connected to a fatal accident. It stated that the respondent had begun sleeping away from the marital home, had removed business records from the home in the middle of the night, and had begun making paranoid accusations against members of the petitioner's family. It stated that the respondent had a commercial diving certification, a passport, and no fixed schedule, and represented a flight risk. It stated that the respondent had involved the minor child in his accusations and had, on the night of the 11th of September, removed the child from a family event and used her to make a statement to federal agents. It asked the court to suspend his parenting time pending investigation. It had been drafted, Verity Ansell noted with professional appreciation, by somebody who had known what the federal investigation was about before the federal investigation had reached her husband. The third thing was that the Ballentines got scared, and scared people move. Adelia Ballentine appeared at Gabe's apartment on a Sunday with a coffee cake. She sat in a folding chair in a mechanic's living room and told Roan Whitlock that families protect each other, that Cabot was a fool who had gotten in over his head with some paperwork, that there was a version of this where a good man made a mistake with a filing system and a family absorbed the cost of it quietly, and that she was prepared to be extremely generous about the terms of a divorce and the terms of a custody arrangement, if he was prepared to be, as she put it, uncomplicated. Roan let her finish. Then he asked her one question. He said, "Adelia, when you were picking the name on those reports, was it because I was the best one, or because I was the one you had in the house?" She stood up, and she smiled at him with her eyes down, and she said, "Honestly, because you were the one nobody would ever believe would do it." She left the coffee cake, and that was the moment the fourth thing began, the one Roan Whitlock had planned for, because everything he had was historical. 68 old documents, a work order from a stamp shop, an old man's confession, an alibi from 2 years ago. All of it real, all of it damning, and all of it, as Verity Ansell had said on the first day, deniable by a good attorney with a straight face. The surveyor did those reports himself, panicked when the Prentices died, went and bought himself an alibi and a story about a second stamp. What Roan needed was for them to do it once more, while people were watching. The trap took 11 days to build, and it was made almost entirely out of things Roan Whitlock already knew. He knew that Ballantine Marine and Yacht was carrying a hull that had come up from a salvage yard in Ohio in August, because he had seen it on the travel lift from the water when he was working a job 2 slips over. A 46-foot Hatteras, gutted, a rebuilt transom, gel coat 1 shade off, and a name on the stern that had been ground off and refinished. He knew, because he had pulled the state records for the 68, that the boat had been titled in Michigan in September under the name Providence, and he knew this was the part that mattered, and he had known it for 2 years without knowing it mattered, exactly what that hull was, because he had personally surveyed it in the spring of 2023, in a yard in Sandusky, after a fire in an engine space, and had written it up as a constructive total loss with a compromised transom core, and had signed and sealed that report, with the nick in the border, and photographed the hull identification number with his own camera. Its name, when it belonged to a dentist in Ohio, and before it burned, had been Kingfisher. He took that to Agent Okonkwo and Investigator Farrow in a conference room in Grand Rapids, with Verity Ansell beside him, and laid the 2 documents side by side, his own genuine report calling the hull scrap, and the state title calling it Providence. Then he told them what he wanted to do. First, he was going to file a formal notice of seal compromise with the Accreditation Society and with the state, a real, dated, public instrument that said that as of that morning, any impression of accreditation number 4419 that did not carry a specific declared physical characteristic was not his. He would also change his report numbering series. Every forged document created after that date would be provably, publicly, not his work, and any use of the old seal after that date was not ambiguity. It was fraud with the light on. Second, He was going to disappear. Not dramatically, professionally. He was going to accept a 3-week contract at Sturgeon Point Marine, 91 miles north, doing haul-out condition reports for Marlin Osgood, a job with a signed contract, a daily log, and 11 witnesses, and he was going to be visibly, verifiably, and continuously unavailable to survey anything in Wexford County. Third, there was going to be a buyer for the Providence. A serious one, from out of state, with financing that required, as financing always does, an independent condition and value survey from an accredited surveyor, delivered before the closing date, which was going to be the 11th of December, which was 11 days before the date on which the Attorney General's subpoena to Ballantine Marine and Yacht was scheduled to be served. They would have a buyer with money, a boat with a lie in it, a closing date, and no Roan Whitlock. Agent Okonkwo listened to all of it with her chin on her hand. At the end, she said, "Mr. Whitlock, do you understand that you are describing an operation in which the entire theory depends on your in-laws doing something monumentally stupid?" And Roan said, "Ma'am, with respect, my mother-in-law has done this 68 times and nothing has ever happened to her. She doesn't think it's stupid. She thinks it's Tuesday." The custody hearing came first, on the 2nd of December, in the Wexford County Courthouse, in front of a judge named Emmeline Rue, who had been on that bench for 19 years and had a reputation for despising exactly one thing above all others, which was a lawyer wasting her morning. Simone Whitlock came to court beautifully. She wore gray. She cried twice, both times briefly and at the correct moments, and she said, in a small, steady voice, that she loved her husband, that she believed he had been a good father, and that she was frightened, because a man who was about to be indicted for something connected to the death of a child was not a man who should be alone with a 7-year-old girl at unsupervised overnights. Her attorney put the federal investigation into the record. He put the milk crates into the record, records removed from the marital home in the middle of the night. He put the parking lot into the record, and he used a phrase Roan would remember, which was that the respondent had, quote, deployed his daughter at a family celebration. Then Verity Ansell stood up and did 4 things in 19 minutes. She entered a letter on Coast Guard Investigative Service letterhead, dated the previous Tuesday, stating that Roan Whitlock was not a target or a subject of the investigation and was cooperating as a witness. She entered the 11th of June, the haul-out invoice from Sturgeon Point Marine, the fuel receipt, and a certified export of the metadata from 440 photographs placing a camera registered to Roan Whitlock 91 miles north of Corbin Bay on the afternoon on which he was alleged to have surveyed a boat he had never touched. She entered the carbon copy work order from Fenno Stamp and Die, with a proof impression stapled to it, dated the 19th of January, in the name Ballantine, along with an affidavit from Ivor Fenno. And then she entered the transcript and the recording of a forensic interview conducted 11 days earlier by Dr. Sunneva Kroll at the Child Advocacy Center in Traverse City, a neutral, protocol-driven interview conducted by a person with no connection to either party, in which a 7-year-old girl, asked open questions in the correct order by a professional trained to avoid contaminating a child's account, described a hand press, a stack of papers, a man, a room, and a burr of steel that poked the web of your hand, and, when asked whether anyone had told her what to say, said, with the flat contempt of the very young, "No, I was just at the party." Judge Rue read for a while. The courtroom got extremely quiet. Then she looked up and asked Simone Whitlock one question, and it was not the question anybody expected. She said, "Ma'am, when did you change the mailing address for your husband's business?" Simone's attorney objected. Judge Rue said, "Overruled. I'd like an answer." There was a pause of about 4 seconds, and Roan watched his wife do the arithmetic one last time, and lose. The emergency motion was denied. Parenting time was not suspended. Judge Rue ordered the child to reside primarily with her father pending trial, which is not a thing that happens, and set a further hearing, and said, on the record, that she would be reading the outcome of the federal matter with interest. 9 days later, the Providence closed. It closed on the 11th of December at 10 in the morning in the glass showroom of Ballantine Marine and Yacht, in a snow squall, to a buyer from Illinois who called himself Emery Tate and who had walked the boat twice, asked good questions, and paid for a slip in advance. The financing package required a survey, The survey was produced. It was 11 pages, on Whitlock Marine Survey letterhead, in Roan's format, over his signature, above accreditation number 4419, dated the 29th of November, describing the hull, the stringers, and the transom of a 46-foot motor yacht as sound, seaworthy, and suitable for the intended use, with a fair market value of $411,000. On the 29th of November, Roan Whitlock had been on a ladder at Sturgeon Point Marine, 91 miles north, on camera, in Marlin Osgood's yard, being photographed by Marlin Osgood's insurance carrier. Cabot Ballentine handed the report across the desk with both hands, the way you hand over something you are proud of. He was arrested in the parking lot, in the snow, at 10:41, and when they patted him down, they found, in the inside left pocket of his jacket, in a leather case that was not cracked, a 2-inch round embossing die, cut in January of 2 years earlier by an old man on Ordway Street, which produced a clean, flawless, unmistakably wrong impression of another man's name. Adelia Ballantine was arrested at her house at 11:20, in her reading glasses, and she asked to change her shoes. It came apart the way these things come apart, which is to say, slowly, in filings, over 14 months, and then all at once in a courtroom over 9 days. The family attorney, Neville Straka, flipped in February and gave them the winters. 5 seasons of salvage hulls, coming into the heated barn under one name and leaving under another. Casper Ridgway was indicted in March, and the affair became a matter of public record in the least romantic way imaginable, as an exhibit in a fraud prosecution. 11 hotel folios, matched against 11 survey binding dates, matched against 11 Thursdays. His wife, Paloma, worked in claims at the same company. She found out the way everybody in that story found out, which was by reading a document. Cabot took 9 years. Adelia took 11, and the judge, at sentencing, spent 4 minutes on the fact that she had chosen her son-in-law's name specifically because he was the man nobody would believe would do it, and called it, correctly, a theft of a life's work. Foster Ballantine died before trial, at home, and was, as far as anybody could ever prove, the only Ballantine who genuinely had not known. Simone pleaded to 2 counts and took 31 months. She had, in the end, done the paperwork, the mail forwarding, the portal password, the templates, the invoices, the voicemail box that nobody ever checked but her. Roan Whitlock's accreditation was affirmed in April with a finding of no fault. The society published his seal compromise notice as a case study, and the following year adopted a rule that every accredited surveyor's seal impression be registered with a high-resolution reference image on file, so that a die and its copy could be told apart by anybody with a lamp. That rule exists because a 7-year-old noticed a piece of steel, and then Roan did the thing that took the longest and that nobody made him do. He resurveyed all 68. It took him 19 months, unpaid, working weekends and winter days, tracking down hulls that had been sold on to second and third owners in 4 states. He called every owner personally. He explained what he was and what had been done with his name, and asked if he could come and look at their boat for free. 61 of the 68 were fine, or fine enough. 5 needed real work. 2 were unsafe. 1 was a family in Ludington with 3 kids and a summer of plans, and Roan Whitlock stood in their driveway on a Saturday in May and told them that the boat in front of their garage had a transom that was going to let go, and watched a man's face go through the whole thing, the disbelief, the anger, the arithmetic, and then the part at the end where he looked over at his kids in the yard. He pulled 2 families off that lake before June. He went to see Thea Prentice in the second spring. He brought the file. He had thought for a long time about whether that was a kindness or a cruelty, and had decided, in the end, that people are entitled to the paper. She read it at her kitchen table for a long time. Then she said, "So it was never sound." Roan said, "No, ma'am. It was never sound." She said, "And this is your name on it." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "But you're the one who brought it to me." They talked for 3 hours. Her civil case against the estate of Ballantine Marine and Yacht settled the following year for a number that will not bring anybody back, and did put 2 younger children through school. Gabe and Neve got married in June on the bluff, on a day with no wind, and Alberta Whitlock, age 8, walked down the aisle throwing pedals with the grim focus of a person performing a technical operation, and got the count exactly right. And on a Tuesday that fall, Roan took his daughter to a storefront with a green awning on Ordway Street, where a 74-year-old man who had lost 11 months of sleep and kept his shop by telling the truth about the worst thing he ever did, had just finished cutting a new die in steel. A new number, a new series, a small deliberate mark in the border that would be photographed and registered before it ever touched a document. Ivor Fenno set it on the counter in a new leather case. He said, "First one's yours, Roan." And Roan Whitlock picked his kid up under the arms, sat her on the glass, and let her press it. "My name is Roan Whitlock, and I want to tell you the part of this that I still think about, which is not the courtroom. It's that for 5 years, 68 families bought a boat and believed they were getting the opinion of a man who had actually gone and looked. They were paying for my hands and my eyes and my back, and what they got was a piece of steel in a jacket pocket. Every one of them was safe or unsafe entirely by accident, and 2 of them found out how much of an accident it was, 11 miles offshore, in June. I did not lose my name because I was careless. I lost it because I never once checked where it was being used. In 11 years, it never occurred to me to go look. I audited hulls for a living, and I never audited my own signature. So here is the appointment I want you to make, and I want you to actually put it in the calendar, on a real date, once a year. Whatever your credential is, license, seal, notary commission, PIN, badge number, degree, contractor number, even just your name on a company's paperwork. Go and pull the public record of everything filed under it. Most licensing boards, most state registries, most professional societies will hand you that list for free, and almost nobody ever asks for it. Read it. Look for the ones you don't remember. It takes an hour. It is the single dullest hour of your year, and it is the cheapest insurance you will ever buy. Because the people who steal your name are not going to steal it in a way that feels like theft. They are going to steal it slowly and politely, and they are going to keep asking how your day was. And the other thing, my daughter told me something at a party that made no sense, and I stood up. I did not ask her to prove it. I did not tell her we would talk about it in the car. I stood up because she is a person, and because the cost of being wrong was that I left a dinner early, and the cost of being right was everything. Believe the small person. Stand up. Ask in the parking lot.